Good evening, all the participants from Digital Futures. Welcome back. So today, we'll have an introduction of today's lecture. Shiqiao Li, Professor Shiqiao Li will give us the third lecture. Before that, we'll briefly introduce the PhD consortium, Doctoral Consortium again. So this year, we have three different courses, including the philosophy and the architecture theory, the left one, and the middle one, which is about the design theory and performance-based technology. And the right column, the third poster, will all the 6 lectures will be given from Patrick Schumacher. He actually will introduce his new thinking on the framework for architecture. So at the same time, I want to also introduce tonight or tomorrow morning in the States and tonight in China, we'll have Anthony Picon from Harvard GSD to give his lecture. So today, before the Shiqiao's lecture, also we want to make some promotion for our new journal, Architecture Intelligence, which the inaugural issue will be launched on the 26th June. And this is the peer review journal for the original research papers, focusing on 3 future scenarios, including smart habit, virtual habit, and space habitat. So the 3 scenarios, and also including some emerging digital technology in the whole life cycle of architecture, including design, simulation, optimization, construction, operation, and inhabitation. So that is the website, and looking forward all the PhD candidates to contribute to this new journal. And Shiqiao actually already gave us 2 lectures. The first lecture is about Indo-European and Semitic divergence, and which briefly introduced the history and also make some discussion on the difference between these 2 different languages system, and which have a profound impact in the understanding of architecture and the evolution divergence between these 2 systems. And yesterday, Shiqiao gave us the second lecture. The second lecture topic is Phenocentrism, the Indo-European linguistic philosophical. So actually, which is really interesting, introduce the phenomenon of the truth in the history on the Western, the difference between the Western philosophy and the hieroglyphic language, and actually which review the potential understanding from different philosophy and the different definition of the two culture, and which leading to the understanding of the architecture theory and the evolution of history. Today, I think we're looking forward. This is the third lecture, the topic which is about the shapes and patterns, the language of similitude. So, Shiqiao probably will actually put forward his new understanding based on the Western linguistic philosophy context, and including the Chinese and Egypt language, and who have actually a new like graphical or the language system actually based on the shape and pattern, where I think which will be very interesting to rethinking the future, the revolving future in which this profound thought can provide a divergent new understanding of the design thinking, and also including design theory and the design methodology. So we're looking forward today's lecture. So let's welcome Shiqiao, and I will give the screen to you.
Let me share my screen first.
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, thank you, Philip, for this opportunity again. I think what you say is absolutely right, and there are lots of thoughts that are interesting, profound, and but also lots of it actually is something that we collectively understand and we know. Somehow um, that knowledge has not resulted in a positioning of our way of looking at the world. And so it's a combination of trying to dig out new insights and new knowledge and reposition existing knowledge. This is really the spirit of it. And then another point to emphasize again is that this is really not about one thing at the expense of the other. It is really about understanding deep enough both sides so that we can understand the gaps. And it is really the gaps, and this is the word that kind of came from the discussion from last two lectures that I thought is really interesting and appropriate. Understand the gaps between the two sides or multiple sides so that we can actually take the gap not as something problematic, but take the gaps as opportunities of dialogue and enrichment. So the first lecture, I introduced the background, the difference, and the origins of the two largest language families in the world. I'm basically cutting across a time period of 6,000 years. In the second lecture, I laid out the structure and the kind of thought language consequences of that particular structure that was at its very, very early stages, was grounded in the form of phonocentrism and the idea that what is spoken is far more superior than what is written. Today, I'm going to talk about a tradition that's different from that. And since I've been kind of discussing these two sides in the past two lectures, kind of side by side, I kind of used multiple examples. I thought that we should probably jump right into the idea of what are the gaps, what do the gaps look like? Can we actually begin to describe some of them? So this is, in a way, not, this is not intended to become a grand theory. I don't think that's the fundamental idea. I would really prefer to see this as some kind of amalgamation of interesting points or some kind of montage of possibilities for us to move forward. And grand theory is by nature very problematic. And so let me just lay out, maybe in the spirit of Bruno Latour, two tables. This is really by far not complete tables, and in no way this is representing any sort of sufficient account of the issues, but it's a start. This gives us 5 general points with which I'm going to lay out the lecture. And the first point, and this is really about looking at the two different modes, the Indo-European and the Semitic. The first aspect that I'm interested in is abstraction versus not abstraction. So when the Chinese describe the world, traditionally, it's not described in terms of mathematical laws or, kind of general principles, but more like conveyed as 10,000 things. One Wu, of course, it's not a precise number, but it's a way of kind of indicating that there's a lot of them, and we don't need to understand all of them. So there's actually less of a kind of making the world objectified as scientific knowledge, but more like embracing the quantity and quality of things in one go. So think about this. We need to kind of contemplate on this. One Wu is so different from science. It could contain scientific knowledge, but it's not essentially objectification of knowledge. The second point to make in comparison is the degree of specificity or not. So as we discussed in particularly last lecture, that when you speak an Indo-European language, you have to be very, very specific about what you're saying linguistically. So you have to use a lot of grammatical markers to specify the condition, the number, the gender, the time and space of a particular thing or action that you're describing. The Chinese really doesn't have that. It is something that I'm going to mention later, is related to a degree of generality rather than specificity. So what are the advantages of thinking generally about ideas? Do ideas become more of ideas if you don't actually twist it or specify it? So that's really something that's interesting to think about. The third aspect is about being and living. Being is the archetypal form of life, I guess, in the Indo-European civilizational mode. So this life, as we talked about yesterday, about the imprisonment conception, it's about renunciation and purification process. It's really about attaining something that I'm not yet. So life is about becoming something. You may never finally become, but that's not the point. The point is really to become so that you actually attain to a being. And that again is something that's very, very dimly perceived and almost like a non-existence in, if you look at the Chinese literati's description of what life should be, not being, but just living. And what's wrong with living? So that really is something that's very important here. Moving on to something closer to architecture, we must begin with landscape. And it's really interesting that Chinese architecture did not begin with architecture, but more like began with landscape. So in the kind of European tradition of landscape, landscape would seem to be something that to be seen, to look at. So you're really looking at landscape. And in the literati sense, and you don't really, looking at landscape is one of many modes of experiencing it. You meander, you conceive, and you link, and you reflect. So it's really about in landscape rather than looking at landscape. Finally, if in the West, architecture is understood as inflected form change, as tectonics. And this is really kind of the routine lectures that we give to students, that they have tectonic exercises. And these are basically kind of grammatical exercises of inflected form change. Garden landscape literature is a different mode. And so that's the last point that I want to make today. Okay, let's move forward. And some of it, I'm tentatively trying to use some examples to illustrate. as some of the students suggested that we should probably talk about some examples on the way. Some I do not. Sorry, this is really maybe to be developed. The first point about abstraction versus 10,000 things. I want to begin with one of the key thinkers, someone who actually made huge contribution in the development of mathematics in terms of calculus and so on. Leibniz, a late 17th century thinker, who lived at the time of two great kinds of events, and one was religious wars. It was a time when Catholicism and Protestantism kind of went to war against one another, thinking that your God is not right, and like all your interpretation of the liturgy is totally wrong, and then so a lot of religious violence. The second thing was that there was a lot of publication on China at the time, and they were published by Jesuits, and Jesuits like Matteo Ricci, who went to China in the 16th century and started to describe their lives and experiences of a culture that's so alien and so different from European culture. So Leibniz was fascinated by all this. He read every possible book on China, he could possibly find. He went to all the lectures and knew all the sinologists, so all the Jesuits, sorry, not sinologists, but the Jesuits who traveled to China and who had some knowledge and direct experience of China. And he was actually quite taken by the binary system that was embodied in I Ching, the trigrams and the hexagrams that those are kind of by. So this image here is actually his way of kind of turning that binary system into a kind of method of calculation that have given rise to our digital culture. So maybe this is the connection finally, that the digital consortium, Digital Future and PhD Consortium is connected with Leibniz, through China, the originator of the binary code. So he was quite taken by the Chinese binary code, and he said that this, a culture that's so advanced should really be looked at seriously. And so he then looked at the language and then started to realize that something's wrong with the European language. Somehow I think that process of abstraction, if you remember the first lecture, the process of abstraction, that middle part of that transformation from thing to language, to him was precisely where things had gone wrong. So wrong ideas came from that process of abstraction. So he was thinking that maybe, just maybe, if we actually change a different language, we may think better. So this is, to me, even though he did not really have a good enough knowledge of the Chinese language, and he was really thinking about the possibility of a different way of language thought, So the language that he wanted to invent, he calls it characteristica universalis, which is a universal character, which is really based on it's a language of mathematical, scientific, and metaphysical concepts. The language that can capture this and stay close to ideas. So that means that you get rid of the linguistic signifiers, you get rid of the alphabet, and think like Chinese characters. So he really kind of proceeded to invent a language like that, and largely inspired by how the Chinese language worked at the time. So his kind of rationale for that enterprise was this, that that in mathematics, when you have a plus sign, let's just stay with the plus sign, it is actually one horizontal line plus a vertical line. So it's kind of the shape naturally suggests that there is a plus going on. You know, it's like one line plus another one. So what he says is that this sign is not abstract. It is actually, it has a real meaning. The meaning is actually embedded in the sign itself. So if we have a language that's based on this principle, then it's really not possible to distort the meaning that the language carries. And therefore, maybe religion will be understood in the same way. There will be no religious differences and there will be no religious wars. And so I mean, that was, of course, his underlying thought. But his real pursuit, of course, is the pursuit of the true philosophical language. So if you think about it, this language is more or less what Wan Wu represents. You know, it's like the language and things capture the multitude of things in the world. Hence he said that this language is really just, you know, is something that uses kind of visual information to capture content, and then, you know, a language just as the ancient Egyptian did, or the Chinese do today, and how they use languages to stay close to the things that the language is describing. This remains something that I think it has a lot of potential. I think this is something that Leibniz started to think, and it hasn't really gone anywhere. And I'm not aware whether this, you know, idea. I mean, there's a lot of linguistic theories that's developed, and some of which I talked about yesterday. But I thought that this kind of Wan Wu understanding of Wan Wu is still an area that needs to be developed by generations of scholars. The second point, the first couple of points are a little bit abstract, and the second point is really about this difference between specificity and generality. And again, I repeat that when you use an Indo-European language, you have to be very specific. You have to use grammatical markers to make sure that the specificity is conveyed. For this point, I would like to introduce an 18th century debate, or more like an early 19th century debate between a German linguist and a French sinologist. The German linguist is Wilhelm von Humboldt. He has a brother, Alexander, is quite famous in landscape architecture, and for those of you who are in that, a naturalist. Remusat was one of the leading, probably he was the first European scholar who was given a chair of the Chinese language or something like that. So it was really probably very early knowledgeable person who knew a lot about Chinese culture and language. There was a debate between them in the journal, it's called Journal Asiatique. It's at the time when, this is a bit of a context, is that at that time when they were debating on the relative merits of Chinese language, the origin of European languages shifted from Sanskrit, Greek, Latin narrative. Shifted from the Hebrew, Greek, Latin narrative and was replaced by the Sanskrit, Greek, Latin narrative. And yesterday I was talking about the discovery, or the day before talking about discovery of the Sanskrit language, and really the language being extremely sophisticated and highly grammatically inflected language. Is it okay? Are you, Felipe, are you hearing me okay? So the question was, well, what about Chinese? And the normal reply to that question was like a Baconian interpretation of the world, and saying that some cultures actually mature too early, some mature just the right time. And Chinese culture was one of the early maturing cultures that was kind of arrested in their infancy. So the use of picture-based language was basically an indication of their kind of early development stages, and therefore it needs to be developed a little bit further. So that's the kind of general narrative. And Humboldt in 1823 in the Journal of Journal Asiatique, and wrote precisely a letter, a small piece, and describing that. I'm not going to read the quotes here. You can read them if you want to. I'm just going to summarize what he said, the main points that I'm interested in. So he said that basically comparing Sanskrit and Chinese, and he says Sanskrit is actually the most perfect language because it's actually grammatically most inflected, and Chinese is the least perfect language among all languages because there's no grammatical markers. So he said that to be able to use grammatical markers to express meanings is just far superior than the language that does not. So he said that. And then Remusa read this article. Sorry, I need to stay with this page. He read Humboldt's writing, and then he started to kind of refute Humboldt's assessment. He said that the language is actually spoken by used by so many people, and the literature was so great. And how can you say that it has no ability to kind of express itself because it does not have grammatical markers? And so he said, well, can we actually understand grammatical markers to be implicit rather than explicit? So you don't kind of spell it out, you can be understood in the mind. And first, and second, he said, Mr. Humboldt, do you actually read Chinese? So Humboldt took that on, and then he actually then studied the Chinese grammar. He really went into, translations of many Chinese texts, and he came back with a different assessment of the Chinese language, which I thought was really interesting transformation. I wish like more people could go through this transformation. And his new conclusion was that both Sanskrit and Chinese are really good, but in very different ways. So then he talked about the two thought language roots, and basically you can put all your grammatical markers in language, or you have none. So what he said is that grammar, in a way, can happen in the mind. So in the sense that if that's the case with Chinese, that it doesn't really have grammatical markers, but the grammatical operations happen silently in the mind. So that to him could actually make the language a lot more flexible, a lot more focused on meanings, in a kind of Leibniz kind of way, in what I just described. That to some extent, the grammatical languages like Sanskrit and ancient Greek present to us as almost like a obstacle of thinking in general. So he says, there is this kind of whole world of generality, the world of pure ideas that can be accessed to if you have a language that has all its grammar silently operating in your mind. So that, to me, is quite a really interesting thought. And then he said the classical language, which can only rarely express themselves in such an indefinite manner, which is, like generality, must use other means to bring to mind a generality they have been obliged to circumscribe with the use of a precise form. So let's stay for like a couple more seconds here. That when you have a very inflected language, when you describe a concept and it becomes very specific, and to make that concept general, which is really an important step, you would have to invent a different kind of world to describe it. And that world is science and philosophy in some way. So the picture that's presented by Humboldt here, I thought it was very intelligent, very thoughtful, and in the end, he said that for Chinese, the mind, for the Chinese users, the mind must turn entirely towards the idea rather than to the inflected grammatical operations that you have to comply each time you talk about something. So you said the Chinese turned an imperfection into a virtue. Well, I don't know. Maybe. He also thought that the use of Western grammatical categories combined with the use of translation as a basis of analysis of non-Western languages conspire to keep us from seeing how they really operate. I do appreciate what has been discussed here, and I have, I think, in another occasion talked about this, and I still think that it is really an important line of thought to trace. And it really, the implication in architecture is very obvious, and we can think about a very recent case of functionalism being the idea of the specificity of architecture, and that the form must look like how it is used. That the house is a machine to live in, and I'm using the Corbusier here, of course. That this is really kind of a close parallel of the language characteristics, and like in Sanskrit and Greek in terms of the specificity of the occasions of use through grammatical markers. What then, how do we actually think about, if we were to think about a different architecture? Recently, I've been a great fan of Attila Des House, and every year I take students to visit Shanghai or visit the office and then talk to Liu Chun about architecture, and he was always explaining his architecture through Suzhou Gardens. So for this new publication, which I hope will come out this year, Attila Des House 2001 and 2020, I wrote an essay called The Return of the Literati, and basically thinking about Liu Chun as is one of the representatives of the generation of architects who are really taking the idea of the literati interpretation of space and architecture seriously. But here's what I really appreciate, that there is actually no formal imitation here. It is entirely an understanding of a principle of looking at the world, almost like a kind of the philosophical level. One project that I thought was really interesting to represent the generality of this ATO house, as was imagined, ATO is Liu Chun's kind of rather imaginative use of the alphabet ATO to represent the Chinese character she, which, like instead of horizontal is actually kind of vertical, ATO. Can you see that? So basically she is a Chinese architectural generality. It doesn't really have a function, or maybe it has all functions. And that's really basically the case, because you take a pavilion and stretch it in one way, it's a hall, stretched another way, it's a corridor, and so here it is, Liu Chun kind of reinventing that. It's a beautiful piece of work, but it's also an architecture of generality. That if you stretch it in one way, maybe, this is just my reading, it becomes a museum, and that you can walk around and you can really reinvent that whole meandering of the Chinese garden. So let's kind of keep the thought at this point, and I have really a lot of other things to cover, but it's an interesting to think that there is a lot of potential that we need to make use of. The next kind of line of contrast is being versus living. This, I must, by now I'm a very good friend of Francois Julien, whose work I really admire, and I really thought that he's one of very, very few people who has deep knowledge of Chinese, but also Greek, and but also Old German and French. So it really is a scholar of special insights. He recently published a book called From Being to Living. I really like the idea of him not trying to develop a theory, but more like developing a lexicon of thought. And he called it Euro-Chinese lexicon of thought, and in which, and this is almost impossible, you should really read this book, it's amazing. It's a summary of many books that have had interesting influences in architecture. Actually, the book on blandness, and the book on landscape and form, and so there's lots of really interesting, influential. Or also the book on propensity. So here is a list of 20 pairs of concepts that he wanted to kind of map out as a lexicon, which I thought is a good way to describe something instead of a theory. I'm not going to go through this, and I only want to take the idea of being and living as modes of existence. Forgive me if this is too corny as a visual representation. I thought that the Christian saint and the Chinese literati, and very often they lived side by side across the world, two sides of the world, of the Eurasian continent. They performed and lived very different lives, and it's really, the saint, of course, was a creature of becoming. It is becoming the saint that was the definition of the saint's life. And the Chinese literati never became, they lived. So the question here, which I thought would be a little bit more vivid to raise in this form, is that to do architecture, should we go to the desert or should we go to the garden? So the Indo-European saint went to the desert. The Buddha, Jesus, Saint Jerome, and Francis of Assisi, and all of them this kind of habit of going to the desert, in which nothing grows, I guess, and that's the point. And they sought through that experience fulfillment, becoming, and towards perfection, attaining of being. Very interesting mode of spiritual life. And the Chinese literati, of course, they went to the garden. They sought poetic living among things, with coexistence, and a nuanced understanding of subject object. It's kind of living among things. Beautiful as it is, are we actually looking at an equivalent in architecture, the desert that the saint, the Christian saint or Indo-European saint went to? That is really a world of a kind of abstraction in a way, beautifully arranged. Or this is clearly a garden. It's all this. So that's really, to me, a choice, an attitude in architecture that can become a way of doing architecture, and can also become a way of educating students in architecture. So leading from there is the distinction of looking at landscape or in landscape. Whatever you do there, you're in landscape. Landscape, you see, that's really another thing that's very interesting to reflect, that landscape as a theme arrived very late in the European. It's like cultures, and maybe Renaissance, in Renaissance, all the landscapes were backgrounds. They were they were playing a role to support the main scene, whether the scene is some kind of Greek mythology or Christian theological scene. Here, previously there was a Botticelli describing some kind of flowery garden, and here's a little bit more developed, I guess, by Albrecht Dürer, who painted this scene of Virgin Mary, but then behind it, if you can see behind, that's actually a landscape. It's quite amazingly detailed, but it's not a main thing. It's the sideshow. So when landscape did arrive, maybe in the late 17th century, and it really became an optical show. When landscape arrived, it really arrived as something to be viewed. So Francois Julien was describing this as the fixing of the eye, fixing the eye to a certain point. And so here's your kind of familiar example of Versailles, Palace of Versailles having really your views fixed at certain points. And of course, this is Blenheim Palace in England, in one of the grandest country houses in late 17th century England, and of course, in having a very similar kind of French-like or Dutch-like views of the landscape. When England, in the beginning of the 18th century, developed its own landscape, very distinctive English landscape, in which the kind of informal landscape forms became accepted. It was clearly still understood as views, like places like Stowe, for example, by William Kent, or Stourhead by Henry Hoare. These are kind of iconic, kind of picturesque. Yeah, actually, the word picturesque is a very good indication of what the landscape is for. It is really a picture. It's to be looked at, and so on. So that really, to me, is a huge opportunity for us to explore, because we look at the Chinese. This is actually George England. If you look at Chinese literary gardens, and there is really no one view. There is no view in a way. So maybe everything is viewed. So there are just countless views. There is also not connected to any kind of externalized curator narrative, not externalized geometry or mathematics. It's literary. So this drawing, I actually got my research assistant when I was writing Understanding the Chinese City to do this drawing. I wanted to maybe really reintroduce writing to a representation of Chinese gardens. I think it was Tong Jun who said that gardens without writing is almost like pointless. You understand nothing. So this is the sizes of characters relating to the sizes of buildings and the importance, and there are little indications of what these names meant in terms of history, literature, emotions, and metaphor, scenery, and object, and so on. So there's a lot of kind of curatorial effort in bringing together Wan Wu as a collection of valuable things. So that curation, to me, is the design of architecture. It really cuts across all kinds of things, the soft, the hard, the living and the dead, the flowing and the fixed. So what really is important for these gardens is that the Chinese literary gardens insist, what they insist is the irreducibility of curated things. None of these are abstract. They're actually real things, but they're curated and they're arranged, not with a mathematical formula or predetermined design sketch, but more like, it kind of came as they went on. So the curatorial effort is not just material, it is also atmospheric. how do you actually curate the sound of raindrops, which may be really important for a corner of the garden? You use a plant like this. How do you actually kind of put a creative, poetic beauty in it? Like for example, this building that you're seeing, the one on the left, is called the Hall of Distant Fragrance, 远香阁. Distant, so there's a lot of invocation here, and there was references to landscape painting traditions of yuan, like distance, it's gao yuan, shen yuan, ping yuan, all these different ways of understanding distances. And perhaps when Zheng Heng's treatise, the Zhang Wu Zhi, the treatise on superfluous things, in which he says, stones bring antiquity to us, water brings distant space to us. So that's the distance in time and space. I think there's also a twist here, because the reference is not for something that you see as a distance, but more like something you smell. So it's a distant fragrance. So there's so much that's going on that's really, do you think this is not architecture? It's not just something to look at, but it's a whole enterprise of the mind, of senses, of creativity, and it's quite incredible tradition that's lying there. I don't think we're using it sufficiently. So the human in this scheme of things is kind of retrofitted. It's not beginning with the human, and how do we enter? Like the typical studio session is how do you enter your building? And maybe that's really not quite important. It's really how do you actually open the scene of this landscape and then retrofit humans in that context. So if you look at a scene like this and you begin to understand, okay, like where's architecture, where's landscape, maybe these are the kind of wrong questions to ask, and maybe we should kind of reframe our mind. And in that environment, this so-called architecture is porous, it's absorbent, it's wrapping around you. There is no perspective, no geometry, and so on. It really also, one of the indications is I was reading a book on Feng Shui, and saying that, okay, well, very often you find the location of important buildings, the Acropolis, for example, they are sitting on top of a hill, or like Monticello, where I live, by Thomas Jefferson. They're sitting on the top of a hill. But top of the hill is actually not the best place to locate a building, because like you don't really have a water source, and you're probably too windy, So the Chinese location is never like that. This is really what Feng Shui is about. It's really about understanding the pattern, understanding where wind and water are moderate and plentiful. This is Francis Julien. He wrote so many books, and each book is fascinating. He wrote a book in 2018 called Living Off Landscape, and he was wondering why the Chinese were able to develop a landscape so early and the Europeans so late in comparison. And he was really thinking about how this particular kind of Chinese landscape tradition could help his own culture, French, Western, European, to really reconceptualize landscape, and the key to do that, he argued, is that I then take a further step and consider how we might undo the self-sufficiency of the subject. This is really important to understand, that the subject is the subject of being or becoming, not the subject of living. So which is really, the subject is the dominant conceit of the Western thought. The way to do it, very importantly, is probably the unfixing of the eye. There is thus no landscape unless there is a deconcentration, an unfixing of the eye, the unfixing of the eye from that, viewpoint, lookout points, and begin to kind of enter into the garden is certainly the first step towards having a real landscape, in not a kind of landscape for looking, but more like a real landscape. In the Against Ontology issue, the Chinese scholar Wang Ming'an, I invited him to contribute a piece, and he wrote a piece called Fu Shi and the Absence of Ontology, very interestingly describing Fu Shi as a manner of seeing from high to low instead of horizontal. And the horizon, Fu Shi is really the act of unfixing of the eye with no ontic being, no fixed focus, with all equalized. A bit like the equalization of things, the Qi Wu Lun in Zhuangzi. Having a very different relationship if you take out that perspective of the eye. I mean, we all know, very familiar with this, and this is really unfixing of the eye, because you don't know where the eye is if you look at this painting. But somehow I think there is, this will be a landscape of generality. All Chinese landscape would be painted as landscape of generality and not specificity. And I'm not just talking about gardens. Actually, we have examples of much larger scale of making of land. This is a picture of the West Lake in Hangzhou, where when I could run the China program, I take students from here to visit West Lake each time, just to be able to understand how that was practiced in the past. The point about, I guess, the larger landscape architecture point brings us to the next topic, which is really about inflected tectonic form change versus garden landscape literature as architecture. So when you said actually it's not landscape in Chinese, of course we know it's actually mountain water. It is something that really, Feng Shui is not one particular thing, but two things. It's Shan and two things kind of stretching a spectrum, so that understanding becomes at least bifocal, and there's really no particular one focus. And I thought Feng Shui is very apt because of the hardness and the softness and the fixity and change and vertical and horizontal and height and depth. And so it really embodies a lot of kind of paired terms that describes the situation without introducing specificity. So Julien, talking about this, and he said, suddenly, if you think the idea of Feng Shui is the unfixing of the eye, and he said, suddenly if we do this, we need no longer be the prisoners of a jailer whose very existence we have never suspected, which is the specificity of thought and language in the Indo-European context. Also, actually, it is century, but not architecture. Architecture is a Greek word. If we want to be a little bit more radical, we should really think about architecture as a term, because it's highly Indo-European. Architecture means the principal tectonics, both of which are completely Greek specific. Greek specificity is grammatical in its very core. Some time ago, I think Chen Xuezhen and his highly respected rocket scientist suggested that we actually maybe we should study specificity, like 山水城市. What if this is really just kind of, half in jest but half serious? And I actually talked about this idea several years ago when I had a debate with Han Dongqing in Nanjing. I thought that in China, architecture should really be taught in combination with literature. So let's have a go here. That assume that we get rid of the school of architecture. I don't know if the dean is not here, so I can say this. In Tongji University, and we install a different school called Shanxi City School. So we would have two departments: Department of Architecture and Department of Literature. So Department of Architecture would teach, like inflected design and functionalism and all the kind of design methodologies. The Department of Literature would really be kind of teaching the literary references that you can make use of, the visual and literary skills that you can frame architecture. So curriculum could really be kind of strategized around 4 areas. And one is resource planning, 资源. The second would be 意境 planning, which is really about how to kind of get into what architecture is supposed to do. And then you have habitation, and then you have 营造, building technologies and so on. Anyway, so it's fun to think like this, and who says that we need to have schools of architecture, particularly when you have a different understanding of what architecture is. So I talk about Hangzhou. I want to really kind of go to a much larger scale. As an example of that, I don't know, maybe Shanxi City through city of a continuous change over time. I want to take a look at a piece of work that was created by a San Francisco-based firm, Tom Leader Studio. Tom Leader Studio TLS, who has been quite interesting. I was, before I got to know them, I was really taken by, through this particular competition project called River First. It's a design for a resilient river in Minneapolis and Minnesota. And basically the idea is to think about river first, and then you retrofit everything else. And thinking about river really meant thinking about birds and plants and water, like the stuff that the landscape architects are very good at. And I thought it's really interesting to reimagine architectural design through the lens of landscape architecture. So they got invited to take part in a limited competition for Xing'an, the starter area, limited area. And they teamed up with SOM, and I thought that the Tom Leader Studios design was really outstanding, Esther Lawrence and myself were at certain point invited as consultants, and we talked about, you know, what a city could be if you kind of think outside the new cities such as Brasilia or Chandigarh, or examples like that. And we a lot of our conversation was really about time, about how, if you don't want to see cities as designed as kind of stylized and inflected objects, and then look at them as maybe a bit like a Suzhou garden, how, how can we reimagine that? How, if, so we talked about time and change and seasons and holidays, and then it just dawned on us that oh man, if you look at the Western calendar, like it's full of saints. It's not, it's either Jesus or saints. It's all about that becoming of being as exemplary kind of exemplary human beings or saints for you to follow. So the calendar really is not connected with time, seasonal change, and food, and clothing and architecture. And if you look at the Chinese calendar, this is an image that was made after our conversation from Tom Leader's studio, that really started to take the 24 solar terms from the Chinese calendar and begin to imagine the city in that way. I don't have a lot of graphics here, and but then a lot of this had been published. So I could take certainly this page, which showed 24 scenes of Xiong'an first phase as a way to imagine the city, almost like a literati garden, but then it's almost like, I don't know, Westlake, but contemporary. We, kind of brought to a contemporary life and much larger population. So it's actually not one city, but 24 cities, and with that 24 city, we can safely, claim that there's one Wu here. So I thought it was really quite exciting, and they got the first prize, and I don't know what the stage is, but I'm sure some of this will be realized, and it's being constructed right now. I need some updates too. So another example I want to talk about quickly is Yu Gongjian and his Turenscape, and I thought that the Hotan Park, although it's it's smaller in scale, but I thought that it was really interesting. It's interesting to see this Hotan Park as primarily not something that is designed for humans. Even humans can enjoy it, but more like it is designed to deal with this, which is really industrial brown sites and polluted water, and that the whole park is designed as a filtration system, but also a pleasure ground. That if you look at the diagram that shows how the quality of water coming into the park and the quality of water coming out of the park, and you realize that this is really this is something. It's about much larger things. I think in the Chinese framework, and this is architecture. We really should take this idea seriously. Returning to Yu Chun, I thought that another very interesting strategy that he uses often, also often by necessity, because he inherited many building sites with the pre-existing structures, was to kind of really think about the principle of 因地制宜 a bit more seriously. I think this is a little bit more than just adaptive reuse. Adaptive reuse is very much focused on building and focused on building's function. 因地制宜 is about much larger context. It's really about 10,000 things. We all know that this is very published, I don't know, like 1,001 places, and the Low Museum in Shanghai, the reuse of the Mingchen Wolf in Shanghai. So this is my kind of way to look at it, is that 因地制宜 is a larger frame. It's not adaptive reuse, and it is really the result of, if you kind of think about it in the direction that Liu Yichun wants to take us, it's really about the unfixing of the eye, a form of 复视, if you like. Riverside passage. Finally, this little tea house, I thought it was probably where Liu Yichun had all his ideas. This is how I would like to imagine anyway. That was tucked away next to his office in a tiny space, but I thought it was really more like a kind of the source of all architectural ideas. It was brought up by his office. Okay, so the last piece of work is done by me. It's an editorial work, and it's the special issue that I mentioned a couple of times in special issue of Theory, Culture, Society. I edited with Scott Lash. It's, what I contributed to this is an expansion of what I started to write about in the book Understanding the Chinese City, but taking it to a much broader framework. And because Theory, Culture, Society is a theory journal, it's minimally connected to architecture, but I would like to make it important to architecture with this special issue. This special issue basically is an issue to think with Francois Julien and Chinese thought. So that's how it is framed in the introduction. What is ontology, you might ask? Well, ontology in a kind of the most kind of simplest way to describe it is a kind of intellectual, I would say Indo-European intellectual philosophical investigation to question what is something. So that really is so fundamental. It really, open a page of Plato and then he says, what is justice? And then open another book and he says, what is beauty? So that really is the mode of investigation that's used unthinkingly most of the time. So the question of what is in another way described by the Greek word ontos, which is about the being of something, the truth of something, the essence of something. So ontology comes from the study of being in Greek. So what's the problem with it? The problem is what Francois Julien has been writing about all along for decades. I certainly have a lot of sympathy with what he has been writing. it's a one-track mind, as we said. It is really about specificity of grammatical markers. It's really about making things kind of functionalized form. It's about kind of removing yourself from the world that you live in so that you can create science and objectivity and objectified knowledge. So all these had been incredibly powerful and useful and all that, and has contributed to the great expansion of this way of thinking about the world in the past 400 years. But we are increasingly aware that it is precisely this way of looking at the world that is ruining our environment. And, we may not have a life left in a couple of, centuries time. So, so that's really important. To me, I think ironically, I thought that many Chinese intellectuals seem to be very busy thinking Indo-European, not thinking Chinese, but thinking Indo-European. I think we need to do both, and to put it that way. It's not that thinking Indo-European is not necessary. It is very necessary. I think, it is more necessary to have both. If you don't actually think about the Chinese tradition, then the popular culture is going to take over, and you're going to have the worst kind of manifestation of nationalism, of historical recreation, of revivalism, of all kinds of really jaw-dropping phenomena that you find in China that are really not very interesting nor open-minded, nor contributive to the world. So that's another problem with it. That ontology has had a huge grip on China. I mean, it's never the same version of the ontology that you find in the West, but somehow I think there's a problem there. Can we think without it? Yes, and this is really exactly what Francois Julien has been saying. If you read this collection of essays, you realize that there are 101 ways of thinking without it. It's good for you, and it's good for the planet. Think Chinese, have a dialogue. So that's it's a kind of a simple way to describe the special issue. And this is the kind of more complicated way to describe the special issue. We have 19 contributions, and we have people like Jean-Francois Lyotard and Bruno Latour, Paul Ricoeur, and Alain Badiou all writing about Julien's writing. And we also have the well-respected anthropologists and such as Wang Mingming and Stephen Fortwan, and critical theorists, Peter Fembers and Joyce Liu, and also cultural studies scholars, Yu Gui and Wang Ming'an from I think this is still in who wrote the essay that I quoted earlier on about Fushi and the absence of ontology. So incredible. My contribution is language, figure, landscape in Chinese thought. I think half of the lecture today had something to do with what I have contributed. Of course, I, together with Scott Lash, and I also wrote the introduction of the whole issue. Very complex, very ambitious, but I thought very rewarding enterprise. So the goal here, of course, is really to be very enterprising, be very productive in terms of thinking about identifying and explaining the, richness of gaps in language, thought language divergence. Latour very instructively imagined the differences being an occasion that will give rise to the figure of the diplomat, and who is able to kind of shuttle between different sides and being able to kind of reach some kind of productive engagement. And I thought that's a really interesting way to imagine cultural divide. Julian's term is dialogue, which is a little bit more conventional, but I think very useful as well. So translation gaps are not problems. Translation gaps are the most fertile grounds. To perceive gaps, we must know and internalize the two sides simultaneously, like a good diplomat. The task, I think, it is for us to rethink thought, language, and architecture. So this sounds like a concluding slide, and because it is a concluding slide, I've gone through a lot of materials, and I hope you find it making good sense. I really hope that more people will be interested in this, whether you're care about digital futures or biological futures, and this is something that we must think about all the time. Thank you. So that's the end.
Thank you, Professor Li. Well, I think in these 3 days or in these 3 lectures, you have laid out a very solid and sophisticated foundation, and also I think it's very a fresh view for us to investigate the difference between the West and East, also the difference of the design sensibilities between the two language lineages. I think let's see if we have some questions from the attendees. We do have one PhD candidate, Wen Zhengxin, who is from our college, and I think he studied with Professor Zhang Xiaochun. Wen Zhengxin, do you have questions? I saw you raise your hand. You can also turn on your.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Hi, Professor Li Shijiao. Is my microphone okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Thank you for the serial lectures. I'm a PhD student from Tongji and enrolled in this course. First, I want to say it's a rare and enlightening opportunity to have lectures combining like linguistics with architecture. I mean, maybe some American theorists and architects have tried the linguistic part back in the 80s and 90s, but apparently I think you are doing it in a quite different way. Because my research experience is mainly focused on the history and theory of architecture. So I want to try to summarize your points first and answer 2 questions from the historical and empirical perspective. Okay, and to my understanding, your main ideas could be probably condensed into the triad diagram as language, thought, and architecture at the very first day. According to this, architecture, especially the form and design of it, is supposed to be influenced by the characteristics of language through the intermediate role of thought. I think your earlier study about the influence of Francis Bacon's empiricism on Christopher Wren may provide an example. So my first question is, could this influence be reciprocal rather than unilateral? Could architecture also affect the pattern of thinking and even the linguistic part? Okay, so that's my first question. And the second kernel may be the difference between the Semitic and Indo-European conventions. As you termed, there's a divergence of the 2 linguistic types. One is like grammatical, phonocentric, and alphabet-based, and the other is non-grammatical, return-centered, and character-based. But one point that confused me is your emphasis on Sanskrit, because in the early modern phases, the Indian architecture was usually categorized as like Oriental together with a Chinese architecture. For example, like the famous tree of Bannister Fletcher. So my second question is like, how do you consider this sort of discrepancy between the linguistic divide and the architecture divide? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. That was, yeah, thank you. I really appreciate your close reading and well thought out question. Architecture, whether it influences language or not, that's really to some degree, but I would say that that the primary flow would be from language to architecture. You know, architecture is often made and remade. I think in the synetic context, and the reciprocal relationship is greater because simply because when these gardens were created and there were no drawings, and they were just kind of created as a kind of reciprocal kind of, you know, habit, understanding, feedback, constant feedback. When you say put up a rock mountain, you really need that constant feedback. After you place one, you have to think about what the next look like. It's a bit like what Julian described as the propensity, and in the propensity of things book, that when a calligrapher writes, he or she doesn't actually have a plan what the size and the heaviness of lines and so on. It really depends on what's written the first on the paper, and then you respond to it, you know. So that's how gardens were done. So if you think the reciprocal relationship, maybe the reciprocal relationship is stronger over there. And the second question is a great one. It really, you're precisely describing the problem of architectural history, because the canonical work that we have been given to read, they do not really have this view, and they haven't really thought about it. And a lot of it, you know, like Fletcher is absolutely imperialistic and phonocentric piece of work, and that dismisses architecture from a lot of places. So, but even if you look at recent architecture history, almost all of them are written from the point of view of some version of Indo-European civilization. A lot of it is really about grammatical, with, you know, inflected kind of form change and context, and, you know, that's in a way that's similar to what I have been describing in the past 3 lectures. So there's a task, I guess, for maybe your generation or our generation, your generation to do. You know, that's really, I mean, that's my assignment for you.
Oh, thank you. That's very clear.
Okay, thank you. Neil, do you have any questions? I just saw you came.
Yeah, no, sure. Yeah, thanks for the lecture. Yeah, I appreciate it, but I've got to say you left yourself open to a lot of potential theoretical critique in a way. I think it was a very ambitious approach to try and draw these generalizations between 2 different sort of, I guess, cultural linguistic approaches that are. And I think you're inevitably going to fail in that respect. I mean, I would start with by saying, I mean, I don't know Chinese culture enough, but I would suspect that Chinese culture is considerably more homogeneous than Indo-European cultures, in the sense that there is, I think the Han tribe is 95%, and I think China's been, to some extent, cut off from the rest of the world over its history for much more than the kind of the way in which I think things have been spreading in the West. And I think that it's very difficult to see Indo-European cultures as a homogeneous entity at all. I think one can point towards a number of different kind of forms of differentiation. I think you could think for maybe, certainly religious. There is huge differences between, Calvinism and Catholicism, Protestantism and Judaism, not to mention all the Indian religions. Absolutely enormous. Even within Europe, we can see fundamental differences between the kind of the Mediterranean sort of cultures, very family-based cultures, and the more kind of ascetic northern cultures. I think there's a question of class becomes a huge kind of a question of divide that's been there, and I think economic outlooks become fundamental. How do you kind of compare a kind of communist society with a capitalist society, a privileged society, and a less advanced society? So there are any number of different sort of fractures that one could pursue and open up to differentiate that thing. But I wouldn't want to try and do that myself. I think any of those is going to be hugely problematic. But I think it's also a little bit problematic to argue from the particular to the general. A lot of the examples you gave were trying to extrapolate general principles from individual examples. And for example, let me just take the example of Versailles, as though the concept of landscape only appeared in Versailles. The point about the certainly Christian tradition and no doubt others as well, is that they began in a garden. The Garden of Eden was the primordial basis of everything. It's not as though the landscape was suddenly introduced in any way at a certain point. It was, and I think
do you want me to respond to any of this?
But maybe sort of stop at that final one quick point. I think the whole kind of way in which the relationship between the countryside and the city has been imbricated. Rus in urbe has been a fundamental concept, and landscape urbanism has been an issue. So I think it's very difficult to, anyway, so I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Neil, I think all scholarship is difficult, and I don't think that's really a kind of something that you should shy away from. And your work is pretty ambitious as well. I don't think that's necessarily an obstacle. And it's something that I think someone like Francois Julien has been living all his life, but he's really made an enterprise out of it. And I thought that it was quite respectable. And I thought that the Garden of Eden, for example, the idea of landscape is a really interesting point. And a lot of the differences, the Garden of Eden is a background to some kind of moral event. And that really is what I'm arguing, that it's not that landscape was not part of Western traditional, even, kind of Indian tradition. It was always there as a background and not as itself. And that's the distinction. In terms of the differences between different Indo-European branches, cultures and religions and so on, of course, there are differences. I know very well these differences. Yesterday I was talking about, categories like the imprisonment conception, that somehow the idea of the dirtiness and purification, so these ideas that work at the level common, sufficiently common across many cultural permutations. So from Sanskrit version to the Greek version to the Christian version. So that's really the level of engagement that we're talking about. Not so much the differences of course, there's a difference between, kind of shades of religion, but then there is a way of understanding the deeper structural differences between civilizations. The commonality here, of course, is the Indo-European language root, and that's how we can talk about this at all, because of the difference between the Indo-European language family and the Sino-Tibetan language family is huge. It's enormous. It's really hard to imagine. And one doesn't, if one doesn't use the Chinese language, it's actually very difficult to understand the impact of that language on your mind. My personal experience has been transitioning from using Chinese to using English. That really, to me, was like night and day.
Okay.
So maybe that's a follow. I mean, but maybe, I mean, I don't know, it's very brave of you to try these generalizations. But maybe, I mean, one of the things that I would say is that there seemed to be a kind of okay, underneath your analysis. I mean, I found your analysis strangely structuralist in a kind of weird way, and quite sort of abstract, you know. And it's kind of curious to have that abstract. I mean, primarily Western discourse, because your sources primarily Western, and then use it as a critique to try and to critique abstraction itself. Mm-hmm. Is that fair?
Well, it's fair, but what I'm saying is that it's really not about one replacing the other, but more like understanding the gap, and you know, that's how I'm able to do it, or you know, I'm able to try in this way. It is, I think that the point here is whether we actually kind of understand and perceive and you know, understand the significance of that divide in the way we actually perceive the world. And we have to really kind of temporarily suppress a lot of the kind of minor shades of differences across so many different versions of Indo-European cultures. And that finer shades of differences is the normative history and theory of architecture that we confront every day.
Can I raise one final point? So I don't want to hog the conversation. But I guess, I mean, first of all, the word architecture actually until Alberti was thought to be Latin. So it's kind of like, I think that's one point. But and that was a crucial point about Alberti's treatise. It was all about define the first page, he defines it. But my point would be is that I think there's a kind of risk in a way about talking about general culture as an architect, assuming that the word architecture or buildings or architecture itself means much to the people. In many ways, the principles should exist outside of individual examples. And I think it's a mistake that a lot of people make, including Chow, by the way, in his PhD, of assuming you have to refer to famous architects and famous architecture when you're dealing with general issues. Chow's was about the work of Andy Clark coming out of Merleau-Ponty and so on. And Merleau-Ponty doesn't need to refer to particular architects. And it's particularly problematic when you think about the fact that actually, frankly, for most of the population, architecture means nothing. I mean, no, my sister, for example, literally, she is a teacher. She doesn't really care about architecture. She has a home, she has shops she goes to and so on. And I think that therefore, if we are going to talk in generalizations, we need to try and step outside of this architectural mindset where there is a limited discourse. I mean, as Rem puts it, we're talking about a footnote of whatever it is, you know, and actually understand that really architecture means nothing to most of the population. I mean, I think that's a bit problematic. Is that fair?
Well, I don't know what you're getting at. Yeah, well, it's Greek or Latin. That I think it, you know, it has certain. I mean, sure, I take that point. But architecture, I think most people have some. You know, I talk to most people that say, you know, I teach architecture, and they go, so, oh, okay, great. So they have some perception of what architecture is.
But isn't their perception?
I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure what your point is.
Well, no, but you know, if I ever talk to the general public about architecture, they normally refer to some building they've seen around the corner that really is not on the horizon of any architect at all. We don't even talk about it. You know,
but I'm giving a lecture to a group of people who are kind of PhD aspiring, or you know, to you who's a theorist who really understand a lot of these things.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that if you see it through that lens, you're getting a very privileged perspective that doesn't, when you're making a general comment about cultures, you can't limit yourself to that particular lens. I don't think that many people would subscribe to that.
Well, yeah, the lens, I guess, you know, there's the point about having academia and having theory is because that we can kind of see broadly and then see broader principles and, you know, kind of patterns and maybe pattern recognition. That's what we're doing here. So that really just kind of forces us to use certain kind of, you know, you call it generalization. But I think the study of language is the study of generalization in some ways, and otherwise none of us can talk about anything really.
Well, I don't know. For me, theory is more about asking questions about particular assertions and interrogating them in more general and critiquing them. You know, if Patrick Schumacher starts writing about parametricism, that's an excuse for me to go and critique his notion of parametricism, which has nothing to do with AI at all, by the way. But anyway, so I maybe I take a different approach. I always think as a critique, a questioning, in the kind of critical theory tradition, where you get a statement and you pull it apart and you unpick it to challenge those kind of certainties and those generalizations. But maybe I have a different approach towards it.
I think you can also see that as a trap that you can never get out of, and basically rendering yourself totally ineffective when you talk about China and Chinese language. You know what I mean? It's really, and then you enter into a kind of a set of references that basically incapacitate you when you want to talk about China. So that really is what made all this, you know, my early work and was in that mode that you're describing. But you cannot enter into China. You know, you have to find a different path.
No, I would agree you can't enter into China. And I think to my mind, China becomes a mirror in which I can begin to think of what it might be to be Western in some ways. But I believe,
yeah. So that's a kind of statement of generality or generalization.
Well, no, I'm talking about but I'm just about my particular experience. You know, I just find that I really can't accept
like the example of Humbert that I quoted was really amazing, because he actually went and studied the Chinese language and came back with a different conclusion.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
it's very important.
We do have two more questions from the audience. One is Ren Cong Cong. Ren Cong Cong would like to ask.
Oh yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good morning, Li Shiqiao. I asked the question yesterday, and today I wanted to repeat it and have a discussion with you. I work in the BUCEA, Beijing Jianzhou Daxue, as a teacher, and I did my research in the history of technology, specifically in timber building technology of China and Japan. And on the other hand, I tried to be a practitioner in timber building design as an architect. So my question is, when I investigated the traditional technology of timber building, I found a huge distinction between the master and artisan. The craft knowledge has been hidden in history, and they pass their technology by tacit technology, by generation, and we don't have many literature on it. And from the point of view of the evolution of technology, you can see that the traditional Chinese timber buildings technology, they stay the same almost years. So till now, what can we do to innovate the timber building technologies? For me, it's impossible because we can't go back to the handmade thing. You know, that's a distinction between master and artisan again.
Yeah, it's an interesting. I mean, like I don't know. You put a lot of burden on me in terms of how to innovate Chinese architecture. I would actually suggest two ways, and One is actually to kind of do something similar to what Liu Yichuan did. Well, the point here is that you can certainly experiment with timber, but then you can actually also experiment with kind of modification of that form without, without losing some fundamental shape. He did it with steel. That's the building that I showed you by Liu Yichuan, and that was almost like a Chinese building, but remade with a different material. So I guess that doesn't answer your question. You want to think about timber. I think Wang Shu has done some timber structure that I thought was also worth looking at, and the roof, the way in which he made the structure a little bit more kind of reflecting the forces in the roof. So that's another way to look at it. And another, at the same time, I would argue that this is really what I was trying to show in my lecture, is that Chinese architecture is not, its center is not in the creating of a single building, but more like using a generic form to create a garden. So do you know what I mean? So the architecture is really outside the building rather than in the building.
Yes. But in my study, I found out that in 17th century in Europe, there are a lot of publications on mechanism art. In those kind of books, they describe the technology of building and blacksmiths and like shipbuilding, and they like written in language of details of the technology, one step by one step.
Well, if you desire that kind of technology, of course, then you have to accept, that the whole premise of architecture that's been described in that context, which is really about the creation of the object of the building itself. But I want to argue here in this series of lectures is to look at architecture as something much larger, and look at buildings as one of many components that you can use. A bit like, I don't know, like the rockery doesn't really change too much, but the use of it changes a lot, when it is used in different contexts. So in a Chinese garden, the building doesn't change dramatically, but the way it is used changes a lot, and that's where the architecture is. And that's why I was talking about the retrofitting of the human. To me, that would be a way of kind of staying with that tradition. Again, I emphasize again, this is really not to kind of, to do these kind of things at the expense of other ways of doing things, but more like having a different understanding and understanding the gap and the divide, the concept.
Yes, thank you. But I already like.
I'm not sure whether I answer your question, but it's an interesting one. Yeah.
I myself found it really difficult to capture, to understand, and like in 17th century, like to write down step by step. And I found it meaningless actually. But I'm already engineering mind equipped, and I have to think that way in many discursive contests. You have to make a more complicated mechanical structure, and to make a better appearance of object.
So yeah, you know, the making of the technical object is you know, that's the thing, and in the kind of European tradition, and but the making of Wan Wu is I guess it's, you know, what the literati garden is trying to do, which is really not about the technical object, but more like everything together curated.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think I may not get the answer I want from you, but you encourage me to think another way.
Yeah, I think you need to think in other ways. Yeah,
I have to. Thank you. Thank you. That's my question.
Thank you. We have 10 minutes to take one more question from Daria Lisaya. Am I pronouncing it right? Daria, are you here? Can you hear us?
May you hear me? I'm so sorry, I can't. Yeah, Professor Li Shiqiao, it's Daria, and I attended your lectures in South China University of Technology. And it was always a fascinating time for me to listen to your lectures. And I think every time you're just widening my mind, and I'm looking at Chinese architecture and Western architecture in different way. I mean, it's just something new what I'm learning, and I'm really thankful for you for this amazing opportunity. And
yeah, even though I can't see you, but I recognize you.
I'm very thankful for this lecture, because I'm constantly thinking about abstraction, and now I'm working with the projects which related to urban regeneration, which is something very special for China nowadays. And many places which we are thinking about, they are locating in cities, in the places which has historical background. And even the buildings are not there, but history is still there. So my question is, we have 3 dimensions, but like it's not something new. So the time is another one dimension. And when you was talking about the garden and the whole of the distant fragrance, I was thinking about that you introduced these 2 symbolic vision of Chinese philosophy on the stones as an antiquity. I mean, that it's kind of time, but which is maybe fixed. Maybe, I don't know, it's my understanding. And the water which introduced the distance. So if we are thinking in nowadays urban projects, and we want to introduce this dimension of time in perspective of Chinese culture, what do you think will be symbolic vision on this dimension, on these characteristics? It's too broad, probably.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question about time, because the Chinese word for time is actually a gap between 2 moments. It's 时间, it's not time, so it's not abstracted, but more like a gap. Yeah, it's a duration. Yeah, it's a duration. 时间 is a duration. Same as 空间. 空间 is like, this 间 word indicates a duration that always takes away time as some kind of abstraction in philosophy, particularly in Western philosophy. So that really is something that you can focus on. I have to introduce another really interesting book called Silent Transformation by Francois Julien, and he talks about Chinese time.
Thank you so much. That's very important.
It really it's really great work, and he lays out the distinction between time as kind of imagined or conceptualized in the Greek intellectual tradition, and how that is so fundamentally different from the time that's imagined by the Chinese intellectuals.
Thank you so much. That's something which I will learn nowadays.
Yeah. It's a very crucial question, because if you go into the Chinese garden, it's really a lot of it is really about time flowing, but then it's actually multi-dimensional. It's about ancient to today. It's also about the time of the short duration, or the time for water to flow from one place to another. So there is really no one particular abstract concept of time. So each time is actually very specifically related to a particular event or thought or reference.
Thank you so much. I will consider this, and I wish we will find a way to introduce that in architecture forms.
Thank you. I think we are almost 2 hours here. I know many of us may have a lot of questions. I think for the 3 lectures, the argument is very clear, but from an academic perspective, I think they are so resourceful, and there's a kind of really complex layer by layer theoretical constructs. So maybe we need to watch the lectures more times to really trace those references to some external materials to really understand the ideas. So I just want to thank you again, Professor Lee, to spending the 3 days with us and giving the lectures. Of course, I think we hope we can have more opportunities to invite you to our college more often, and maybe.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, I think there are all kinds of responses. I think a lot of the issues that needs to be teased out, and with I really like spontaneous developments, and I mean, as well as, of course, formal lectures, but I think the spontaneous discussions very often very helpful to think through this.
And also your upcoming special issue may helps to kind of explain a lot.
Yes. Ideas. So that will be kind of released slowly, batch by batch, by the Theory Culture Society website, and so you will see. Yeah, I will send this links to you. Maybe next time I visit Tongji, as your dean promised.
Maybe in person in the future.
I will bring the stuff. Maybe we'll ease some of the fears of of the audience, and thinking that it's too big a topic.
Okay. Thank you again.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you, and it's been a great pleasure, and hope to see you all in person.
Yeah. Okay. We will keep in touch and with emails with some following issues. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Very good. Bye.
Bye, everyone.